Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog. Oh, so controversial. A new meta after 4 years. Oh my god. Well, today I'm going to qualify and quantify some of the aspects that we have completely ignored as a community to our detriment. And at the end of it, you just might find your new meta. Let's go. Now, for too long, I think we've looked at this game through blinkers, and I don't know where we lost our track, but along the way, in the last 9 months that I've been putting out videos, I've tried to open people's eyes by throwing some new information your way, and I've done that through a number of different videos. This is just 5 of them, where I start to question what we've been focusing on. And it's not until you actually take in the complete, complicated and beautiful picture that this game offers you that you start to realize we might not be getting the full story. In my Pillars video, I introduced what I considered to be the cornerstones of this game, being damage, duration, and frequency. That applies to your weapon as well as your build. And in the two-way firing range that is the open world, the enemy gets a say in your equation as well. Now, weapon and weapon damage, we have got this covered. It is something that has been covered to absolute death, and for the longest period, it is one of the only things, if not the only thing, that the community has focused on. The juicy Chad alpha large numbers that come from a high weapon damage and a high RPM. But we too often forget so many other aspects to this game. Damage multipliers, chasing those big numbers for weapon damage and increasing that RPM. Again, we are all over this. We are constantly searching for that extra tiny little percent and the fractions of a millisecond in time to kill from our builds. That's it. That's all we've focused on. We know this stuff inside and out. But this game is a glorious wonder and has so many more aspects to it. Rounds on target. I cannot overstate its importance, and it's certainly going to be a major feature of today's video. The enemy has multipliers as well. They do it through numbers. It's generally us versus a lot of them. The damage that they produce is dictated by their class and type. I've covered that in a different video. Different enemies do different amounts of damage. They also have accuracy issues and rounds on target issues. The closer that you are to them, the more rounds that they will land on target and the more dangerous that they are. You also have duration. The amount of time that your weapon can produce that weapon damage and RPM that you have calculated so efficiently has a major factor on your damage output, and we've ignored it for too long. Your build will dictate how long you can actually fire for, and it does that through mitigation, absorption of damage. You can divide the damage, not just focusing on you, so the enemies don't just focus on you, and you can interrupt the damage that's being done to you. That is detracted by the fact that you can be staggered. That interruption can happen in a stagger to your damage as well. When you get hit with a grenade or your shield breaks, that occurs to you. We normally only associate it with the enemy, but it certainly happens to you, and it actually forms part of the most dangerous part of this game for you. The enemy also has damage mitigation and damage absorption. They will take cover. They also have armor or armor plates. They can also divide damage. They have turrets which force you to focus onto the turret because it's a dangerous enemy. The drones are a dangerous enemy, and they force you to focus on them rather than the thing that's actually producing the drones itself. And even so much so that a sniper drone, although it provides no damage to you whatsoever, it's just an annoyance, nothing more, because it looks like one of the more dangerous enemies, being an exploding drone, you will quite often focus your attention onto that drone mistakenly. Their damage can get interrupted far more often than what yours can. There are a number of different ways that we can interrupt that. Obviously, crowd control mechanisms are certainly one of the easiest ways to interrupt damage that's coming your way. Stagger, the one that we associate with enemy, and something that weapon damage and RPM in fact improves, is one aspect of the duration of damage that an enemy can sustain to you. But something that we don't possess that the enemy does is weak points. Another thing that we don't pay a lot of attention to. Although we know it's a factor, it's not something that we actually draw attention to. We then have frequency. Reload speed for the weapon. Your weapon produces damage, then it stops. Getting back into the fight and being able to produce more damage is dictated by your reload speed. An important factor, again, completely ignored and completely, literally disregarded in a burst DPS calculation, in the old burst DPS calculations. How we ever got to that point, I'll never know. There's also something about target acquisition, not just your ability. It's not so important for an SMG or an assault rifle, but it definitely becomes more of a factor when we start talking about things like shotguns and rifles and MMRs. When I get into those weapon types, that'll definitely be something that we'll be talking about more. When it comes to your build, your ability to get back into the fight from a situation where you haven't been able to produce damage is dictated by your ability to replenish armor, regenerate armor, or replace that armor with a medkit, for instance. The enemy also does the same thing. They have replenishment and regeneration. We all know how hard it is to take down a bunch of enemies inside a couple of heal box fields. They will also replace their armor. Hunters are notorious for using numerous medkits when it comes to trying to take them down. They have those abilities too. But this is the complete picture of the game as best I can do in a single page. And yet, for the longest period of time, content creators are especially guilty of this, but they focus on just these two aspects. And our meta builds have been defined by these two aspects and these two aspects alone for far too long. I'm over it. It's time for a new meta. And today I'm going to qualify and quantify many of these other aspects which can significantly improve your damage output. Quantifiably more so than some of the other aspects inside those orange boxes. Today I am going to focus on these three things: rounds on target, time to fire, and reload speed. Quantifying and qualifying these aspects and how much they can multiply your damage output when you focus on them. And the reason why I think it's been so hard for us to actually understand these when it comes to weapons is because we've been thinking about them the wrong way. We actually understand these aspects when we refer to skills. So I thought, let's just imagine that a weapon is a skill for a second. We then have its applicability, the uptime of the skill, and then the cooldown of that skill. Oh look, a new skill, an assault rifle. The FAMAS assault rifle acts as a primary weapon. Using this skill exposes the agent to damage, okay? Missed shots reduce the active damage, righto? The assault rifle tier increases with red core attributes, right, got it. Active damage is 662,865 at tier 0. Okay. Active duration 3.33 seconds, and its cooldown is 2.2 seconds. Interesting. When you start to think about a weapon in the same way that you think about a skill, these other aspects of its duration and its cooldown become much easier to understand, and I don't know why we've ignored them for so long. We are traditionally intent on this damage column. How much damage can this skill, can this weapon produce? But when you actually consider how long that skill can produce that damage for, and then when it's completed doing that damage, how long its cooldown is and it's able to get back into doing damage again, the picture starts to open up and you start to understand, in this case assault rifles, on a much better level. Because when you combine all of those factors, the rankings look very, very different. Multi-target DPS, when you have multiple targets in front of you and the weapon is able to fire for a much longer period, the skill's duration is longer, then that weapon will perform better. When you're looking at single targets, so you're taking down a single target, then essentially you are destroying that skill and it goes down onto cooldown, then obviously the cooldown becomes a much more important factor. How quickly that skill can be up and running again is very important, and generally the weapons with a shorter reload time are going to perform better at single target damage. But what I want to focus on first of all is what I consider to be the most important factor when it comes to damage. Most of the time we're just focused on how much the skill produces as damage. But if you look at the skill, there is a very important factor that many people ignore, and that is missed shots reduce your active damage. That active damage that's displayed there, 662,865 at tier 0, is the maximum amount of damage that you can produce, and every missed shot reduces that active damage. Once again, I cannot overstate how important rounds on target is, and so I'm going to attempt to state how important it is. This is your total magazine damage. If on a normal weapon system you have 50 rounds in that magazine, every round that you have equates to 2% of that total magazine damage. Yep. For some of the other weapons, it's a little bit different. So St. Elmo's, for instance, each bullet equates to only 1.43% of its total damage output. It's actually one of the advantages of the St. Elmo's and its larger magazine capacity. Because when we look at something like the Bighorn, the FAL, or the Capacitor, each one of their bullets equates to around 2.5% of their total magazine damage. Now, as I've pointed out in this video specifically, but there are a number of reasons that are unavoidable as to why you will never get to use that total magazine damage. Now, you can definitely get better at accuracy and rounds on target through practice. I'm pretty experienced with this game, but here on this legendary sniper, perfect example, I'm unable to ever realize 100% of my magazine's damage. The movement of the NPCs is unpredictable. Sometimes they even defy the laws of physics, but they're unpredictable and you are going to miss rounds. And in that last video, I introduced overshoot, and because of the unpredictability of RNG when it comes to crits and the like, you are never going to be able to perfectly predict when that enemy has in fact died, and so you are always going to overshoot and lose some of your magazine damage in that respect. Your reaction times for both stopping doing damage but also tracking the movement of an NPC are never going to be 100%. You are going to lose damage from your magazine and it will never be realized, and that has a significant effect on your total damage output, more than you realize. This is the loss of damage that is represented by every percent of your magazine that is missing. It's a little difficult to grasp, but each bullet is 2% of your total magazine damage. But every time you are not using the full magazine, or for every one of those bullets that's missing from the magazine, each one of your bullets now represents a larger percentage of the total damage that you can output. Going from 2.04% with the first bullet all the way through to infinity at the last bullet. If you are only hitting one bullet out of your magazine and you now miss with that bullet, you have lost an infinite amount of damage because you're now doing 0. So accuracy sits on a spectrum somewhere between infinity and nowhere near 2.4. It actually sits a lot lower than that. And that is because of overshoot and missed shots. It sits somewhere in the middle. Now, your weapon's ability to be able to get rounds on target obviously is controlled by you. But the easier that a weapon is to control obviously makes the job easier on you. This is a graph from my weapon handling video. Going from left to right is how easy a weapon is to handle. Now, newer players are definitely going to gravitate to weapons that are on the right hand side of this graph, easier to control. As you get more experienced in the game, stability becomes less of an issue for you. You are used to a weapon's recoil path, and therefore you are able to control some of the harder to control weapons to the same degree that you are able to control some of the easier ones. I mean, there's a lot to be said for not having to think about it, because being able to control a FAMAS at the level of an M4 takes a lot of concentration. So many people will just stick with an M4, but there are more reasons why people will stick with an M4, or, for instance, will favour something like the St. Elmo's, which sits roughly around here. And that is to do with accuracy and its effect on stability. Yes, you heard that right. Accuracy, the attribute, has an effect on a weapon's stability. And that is because the little random number generator that generates the dots as to where your weapon is going to fire has a window or an aperture or a bloom within which it will operate. The worse the accuracy, the larger that random number generator has to generate space for the bounce of that bullet. Now, normally it will just bounce all around and it will average out so that you are basically tracking in line with the weapon's recoil path. But occasionally, what will happen is that random number generator will produce a string that will be on one side of that bloom. And when you are tracking with your mouse or your controller, that tends to have you either slow down or speed up depending on which side of or which quadrant those dots have landed in. And then when it jumps to the other side, because obviously it's always going to even out as far as randomness is concerned, that causes bounces within your ability to control that weapon. Now, when we're talking about a more stable weapon versus a less stable weapon, in this case the CTAR versus the FAMAS, this has an impact on your rounds on target. With a CTAR, the trajectory is less aggressive and it is more vertical, Both of these things assist with getting rounds on target. With the CTAR, although its accuracy is worse than what the FAMAS's is, the trajectory is more stable and easier to track. And if you do make a mistake, or if there is a random bounce within that trajectory, because the path is vertical, that generally doesn't affect you too much because you're already shooting at the center of scene max, and a bounce will lead you up to the head anyway, sometimes actually improving your damage output indirectly. Whereas with the FAMAS, because that bounce can be more aggressive and the distance that it will travel in the same amount of time is worse or farther, what can happen, and its trajectory is not vertical, what will happen is one of those random bounces will mean that you are now firing off target and missing rounds. So accuracy can have effect on the weapon stability, and both of those two aspects combined amount to rounds on target. Here is the accuracy for each of the weapons when you account for an experienced player's ability to control the recoil. And this also has an effect on rounds on target. So the size of the bloom, not only will it affect the stability, but it will also affect your rounds on target just purely by having a larger bloom. If I give you the legendary sniper example again, here is the trajectory for a larger bloom weapon system. And you can see that a large portion of that bloom sits outside of the target area. If I tighten up the accuracy on my weapon, exactly the same motion path as before, what you can see is that the bloom sits outside the target for much less of the time, meaning more rounds on target. Now that's not only the reason for improved stability and accuracy and how many rounds you land on target, and it does not just apply to targets that are further away. Common misconception. Let's take these targets for instance, where we are shooting now for a much smaller target, but by doing so we improve our damage output and our TTK, in some cases by up to 300%. That's a massive multiplier to your damage by simply targeting on a smaller area. And a weapon with a larger bloom and is harder to control is going to have a more difficult task at being able to achieve that. Let's take a tank for instance. Now, I can interrupt the damage of a tank by focusing on either its ammo box at the rear or on the belt of ammo that it's using to fire at me. That's going to be a common strategy to prevent that enemy from doing damage to me. Both of those require accuracy. But what will then happen is after you've interrupted that damage, you then have a period of time in which you can do damage on the actual target itself. Most people will opt to take the largest target possible, being the center of scene mass and the torso of the tank. The torso of the tank in solo heroic has 10 million health points. The helmet also has 10 million health points. But what happens is, and why it takes you longer to take down a tank than what it does other enemy types, is because when you are shooting for the torso, what you're also doing is hitting another armor plate, being the arm, which has 7 million health points of its own. So you're dividing your damage between a 10 million health point torso and a 7 million health point arm, attempting to get to the health that's behind that armor plate. If you have greater accuracy, you can target an area outside of the arm and deal damage just to the 10 million health points that that one armor plate of the torso has. Many people have actually found that it's easier just to go for the head. You don't get any headshot damage, but what it means is that I now have uninterrupted access to one single armor plate, being the helmet, at 10 million health points. What a lot of people don't understand is that every limb has only 7 million health points, as opposed to the torso and the head with 10 million. I can go for a larger target, being the leg, at only 7 million health points, to get to the 3 million health points of the actual enemy's health that sit behind that, 7 million plus 3 million equals a total of 10 million, and 10 million health points for a tank actually equates to around about the same as a normal elite. It should take you the same amount of time to take down an elite as what it does a tank. The only difference being is that the stagger that occurs when you break that armor plate in between, which doesn't occur for an elite. So minus the stagger period, the time it takes you to take down a tank should be exactly the same as what it is for an elite, and that comes down to your ability to land target or rounds on that target that you're aiming for. A target on the left is further away. Smaller target, accuracy plays a part. Number of rounds that you can land on it obviously increases with the better aim that you've got. Target on the right, many people will actually find this a more difficult target to take down than what a tank is, because of the very small windows that exist for you to actually deal damage to the health of the enemy. Most people, because they have high damage builds and they haven't focused on rounds on target, haven't adjusted their weapon handling, will just burn through a shield in order to get to the enemy. They will focus on the aperture, even if they don't land many on target. If they do get a few rounds through the aperture, it might be enough to stagger that enemy, and when they stagger, obviously they completely expose themselves and they can be drilled down. That is, again, your ability to stagger that enemy comes down to your ability to fire through that small window. If you can do that more effectively, you will reach that point of stagger much quicker than a high damage build, because you have more rounds on the target that you're aiming for. Headshots, another thing people chasing the big numbers are looking for. That crit headshot sounds juicy, and the sound of it, an enemy dying, also sounds juicy, but
it's a trap!
Yes, it's a trap. Here we have the legendary sniper once again. The smaller accuracy dot or accuracy bloom that we used before. This time we are going to compare it to going for headshots and see what that difference makes. As you can see, attempting to go for those big numbers on the head will generally lead to far more of your magazine being fired into thin air than what it is in actually getting rounds on target. And the increase in damage provided by a headshot will never amount to the loss of damage that comes from missed shots. So let's actually quantify what those missed shots for the average player will look like. Most players will average somewhere around about 50% accuracy when you take in overshoot and just generally missed shots. It's worse with a higher RPM weapon and better with a lower RPM weapon for a number of reasons, but let's say 50%. If I can land 5 more shots out of my magazine, so just 5 shots, so that's a 10% improvement on my rounds on target out of the whole magazine. I've gone from 50% to 60%, which is 25 bullets landed, to 30 bullets landed. That 10% improvement on rounds on target equates to a 20% multiplier on your damage output, because I've gone from 50 to 60, and that 10% of the 50% that I started at represents 20% improvement on the outgoing damage. If I go to the diminished returns or the improved returns graph over here, if I go to the 50% line, we're looking at around 4% from every single bullet. Every single bullet represents 4% of my total damage output, which is why an additional 5 bullets landed, or 10% rounds on target landed, will equate to 20% more damaged output. 5 more bullets, 20% improvement on your damage per second. Alright, let's move on to the next category. That next category is frequency, or the cooldown of the weapon. Now, before I did my reload data investigations, the advertised cooldown or reload time for the FAMAS is 2.2 seconds. But I can give you an example of, like an over-exaggerated example. Let's look at the Bullet King versus the FAMAS. The Bullet King, that skill, has 0 cooldown. I can continue to do active damage for the entire period. And so the FAMAS, despite a considerably higher active damage amount, cannot compete with the Bullet King as far as damage output is concerned. And that is even if I hinder the Bullet King to take a brief respite from taking damage in cover and come back out again to do more damage. And keep in mind, this isn't the made up data that's in the stats sheet of 2.2 seconds. This is the actual TAC reload time of the FAMAS at about 1.65 seconds. Even with that reduced cooldown period that's offered by the Bullet King will produce a larger amount of damage in the long run. Your ability to be able to do that obviously is reliant on your build, but that's something that we'll cover in the next video. But if you thought that, great, you're thinking the right things. If we quantify what the difference is, we can look at the FAMAS specifically. The FAMAS, 3.33 seconds of fiery time, and under the old terms, 2.2 seconds worth of reload. I'll just use those just for example purposes. That 2.2 seconds cooldown represents 40% of your damage output time. If I put one weapon handling attribute onto my gear, that's an 8% reduction in reload time, bringing it down to 2.037 seconds. That now represents a 3% improvement on my damage per second. But what am I giving up to have that damage? Let's say that I give up a 12% crit damage mod. That 12% crit damage mod represents 3.7% of the active damage. Well, clearly that's not a good trade-off. But that's if we're allowing the weapon to fire for the entire period of its magazine. And that's also assuming 100% rounds on target. If we're only firing for 2.66 seconds, that 2.2 seconds now represents 45% of my damage output time. If I'm down to 2 seconds for how long I'm firing for, that's now 52% of my damage output time. And for the average time to kill on even a crappy red build, 1.5 seconds is the firing time that it's going to take you to take down an average enemy, which means that your 2.2 second reload time now represents 59.5% of your damage output time. An 8% saving on reload time now represents 4.6% DPS improvement. The 3.7% that was added by your 12% crit damage mod, it never changed. It still represents 3.7% of your damage output, regardless of how much that damage is output. So it has remained at 3.7% all the way down to your average TTK time. Now your 8% handling attribute is now producing more damage than your crit damage attribute. And that's before even factoring in that weapon handling also improves your rounds on target. Which means that as far as most effective, at the base level, that weapon handling attribute is providing you 24% more effectiveness. If you can land 1 or 2 more or 3 more, that's probably stretching things a bit far, but between 24 and let's say 300% more effective at adding damage to your build. let's go to the very last one, being duration. The duration of the FAMAS skill is 3.33 seconds. What we have been traditionally brainwashed to believe, or conditioned to believe, based on these spreadsheets where DPS does not include reload time, it gives you the very, very false impression that burst DPS is considerably higher than sustained DPS. That is so far from the truth, it's not even funny. If we look at my best AR video where I quantified the multi-target DPS, so you've got multiple targets in front of you and you allow the weapon to fire for its full duration, taking or doing as much damage as it possibly can before it needs to reload. And then you have the single target DPS, which is killing an enemy, reloading, killing an enemy. So burst firing that weapon. If I convert the DPS produced by taking down enemies one at a time into the same format as the multi-target DPS, the reduction is significant. In the case of the St. Elmo's, which is the number one in both cases, taking down enemies one at a time and reloading in between reduces the effectiveness of that weapon by almost 21%. If I can sustain damage, in the case of the St. Elmo's, I have a 21% multiplier available to me. And if I take, under the traditional terms, before the St. Elmo's rocked up on the scene, the highest burst DPS weapon being the FAMAS, and I compare it to the ACR, which was one of the lowest, if not the lowest, burst DPS weapon, but now I allow the ACR to do its full complement of damage, whereas I use the FAMAS in the way that we've normally used it, which is burst firing down enemies. Even though the FAMAS has an 8% expertise advantage, the ACR, allowed to do sustained damage, still takes down those enemies quicker. That is the power and the quantifiable power of being able to endure damage and allow your weapon to do the maximum potential that it has available to it, which is sustained damage. So, across the board, what we've now seen is 3 different elements: accuracy and stability affecting a weapon's damage, duration affecting a weapon's damage, frequency or the weapon's cooldown period affecting damage in a quantifiable amount. And in each case, the amount of damage output that you can multiply your build by factoring these in, significantly, quantifiably more damage. As in, the most effective tactics available. Now, many of you will have started to think outside the box and more than just those little windows, and you'll be saying things like, well, that is provided that the build enables you to be able to do that. And that is the right question, and what we are going to discuss in the next episode. It comes down to that skills description. Using the skill exposes the agent to damage. And in many cases, that exposure to damage is one of the significant limiters on your ability to produce damage. And that's what we're going to cover in the next episode. If you like the video, then like it. If you want to see that next episode and you want to see more, subscribe. Hit the button, it's just down there. and I will see you in that next video. Log out.